Hi everyone, I think we'll probably just make a start. Apologies, we're running a bit late, had some technical issues with the Wi-Fi. Thank you for coming along to the third instalment of 3 webinars focusing on preparing for the future. And tonight we have Steven Thomson, who is an agricultural economist with SRUC, who is going to give you a bit of an update on policy. So I'll just hand you straight over to Stevie.
Hi there. Hopefully you can hear and see me. I've been having some terrible technical issues at Edinburgh. Given that I'm in our headquarters, our Wi-Fi and our main internet connections all seem to have gone down tonight. So hopefully this will all work. I'm going to switch my video off to just save on bandwidth, and hopefully if you can't hear me, somebody shout. So agricultural policy, where are we going? What do we know? It's a question that I get asked quite a lot, and I do an awful lot of talks trying to give people where I think we're going and what we need to know, and what we can get on with, rather than waiting for the fine detail. I'm going to start with the take-home messages just in case I do get cut off, and in case people have to dash out. I mean, the number one thing is change is going to occur, policy changes happening. It is slower in Scotland than elsewhere. We've seen change happen in England, and remember that their basic payments are getting tiered out by 2027, with their sustainable farming scheme coming in replacement of that. And then in Wales, they're further ahead. So the take-home message is that will be the same in the future, and that there are new conditions coming on your support payments, starting next year, as far as we're aware, even though the full announcements not come yet. I'll talk about that later. And the other thing is, we know that budgets are under pressure, and agricultural budgets are under pressure, but so are all the other budgets in government. But the government are trying to achieve quite a lot with the existing budget, and if we're to truly deliver everything the government want, the likelihood is that we need a much larger budget. And this is where government are saying that private sector need to come in and support some of the transition that they're looking for. Agriculture is really asking, the government are going to ask farmers and land managers to do quite a lot, because quite a high proportion of Scotland's emissions are coming from agriculture and land use. And my take on that is that that's just a natural thing, that land use and agriculture are relatively net emitters, even though we've got sequestration. We also have quite a lot of emissions from peatlands and things like that, which we should be focusing on much more than we are at this moment in time. Kind of main message is that those that are delivering and already achieving on biodiversity and technical efficiency, you should get rewarded in the future, and the future suite of payments are meant to be designed that those that are already delivering are rewarded, and those that need to go on a journey will have to go on a journey. And the key thing I would say is people are probably unaware of how to engage with Scottish Government, and that needs to be overcome by government and by the industry. Quite a long time ago, in May 2018, which is nearly 6 years ago, the agricultural champions wrote these words, which was, they were talking about after a transition period, there needs to continue to be some basic income support, albeit at lower level, and that there needed to be a menu of schemes designed to produce to stimulate production efficiency, or improve skills and training, or enhance nature and biodiversity. And at that time, they also said it may need to be capped at a farm and have a regional and sectoral need. So it's taken us 6 years to get to the starting line, and what we're starting to see emerge in the agriculture bill and in the design of, or the discussions about the design of future schemes, are exactly what the agricultural champions talked about. in that there are suites of measures that people may be expected to do in order to get some of their support payments. Just to be aware before I go into the policy bit is that your wider operating environment is changing, and it's changing on a daily basis at quite a rapid pace, I would say. In that the financial sector have got an obligation to report to the Bank of England on the carbon emissions of their lending portfolio. And if you go and speak to the likes of NatWest, RBS, they will tell you that agriculture may be, if it's not, one of the biggest emitting sectors on their balance sheet. So they're interested in how they can use or leverage carbon emission reductions when they're lending money to the sector. Equally, coming forward in the future will be biodiversity net gain. They're going to have to start reporting on biodiversity measures, and that will mean that they're also interested in what's happening with nature. The second one along the top is a thing called Scope 3 emissions. And if you're in the dairy sector, you'll already be aware of some of these things where the retailers and processors are increasingly interested in your carbon emissions. And that comes with an opportunity for agriculture if we can get recompense for reducing emissions, doing things more efficiently, and doing the reporting that's required in it. There is also a risk, though, is that they pay for it for a while and then just expect it as a norm. So we need to make sure that farmers are fairly rewarded in that transition. There's a whole series of international obligations, and every time people go to ministers or whether it's at UK government level or Scottish government level, go to things like the COP, then we end up coming back and hearing that we've made commitments to reductions or nature recovery or some kind of target by some kind of deadline, which is all fine and well, but it's easy for politicians to make commitments without understanding what the pathway is to delivering against those commitments. And that's one of the things that in the Just Transition Commission that I sit on, we're increasingly coming across on every sector that the government are dealing with, is that there's lots of ambition, there's lots of targets, but the pathways and the budget delivered against these targets are often not fully thought out. You'll have seen the vision for agriculture. The words sustainable and regenerative farming are there. We're leading in those things. It was interesting at an evidence session in late November that the head of agricultural policy in Scottish Parliament had talked about there is no need to define it because it's a set of principles, and if you define it, then it will not fit everybody. So I would take him as a word, and we shouldn't bother about worrying about the terminology here. Rather, it's a set of principles. And the other thing that we also need to acknowledge is that the First Minister launched at the Highland Show last year the Sustaining Scotland, Supplying the World, the food and drink sector strategy. And that means that there's an ambition for Scottish Government to actually grow the food and drink sector, of which agriculture is the cornerstone, the foundation industry. On these Scope 3 emissions, and as I said, if you're in the dairy sector, you're probably at the cutting edge of this. The poultry sector and the pig meat sector are also going there. It's starting to see some of it starting to come into the malting sector, malt barley sector, where people are starting to pay for carbon audits to be done. So if they're paying for carbon audits to be done this year, the chances are that there's going to be conditions in the private sector coming down the line. My big concern is how do you do that in a stratified agricultural system where we've got sheep produced in one area being finished somewhere else. Same goes for beef. And if you look at that line of who's after your emissions, everybody from the transport sector, the distribution, the retail, the food, hospitality sector, everybody can do their bit to cut emissions, but the biggest emissions with regards to food come at the farm, and that's just the nature of it. And there's also the biggest opportunity to reduce emissions in our food sector are there, plus in waste. Food waste is massive. It's a huge component of it. But also the ability to sequester only sits one place, and that is with the farm. So land managers and farmers have got an opportunity in this new world. And this is an opportunity because this process is meant to level the playing field up if they're buying food from New Zealand, Australia, wherever. The agricultural budget, the yellow dotted line is what the agricultural budget is when somebody tells you it. So it's roughly, if you took LFA payments and all the direct support payments, it's roughly 30 million quid. And that's fine, but it's been static. It's been static for a long period of time. The fluctuations with exchange rates, nothing else. And in terms of the purchasing power, if we strip out inflation, then the purchasing power that the government have over the industry is declining very quickly. So taking 2021, the 510-ish million or 20 million, I can't remember what the number was exactly, would have bought 900 million quid's worth of inputs right up until 2006. This current year, it'll probably be under 400 million. So with inflation running, or agricultural inflation running, and we should never ever let them use the retail price index or consumer price index, because farmers and crofters and land managers are not buying inputs that are your general household objects. So what this is using is the agricultural price inflation, and we should never let them use that. And this is the element. They're asking the industry to do an awful lot more, yet their buying power is falling off the cliff face in terms of inflation. So my question always is this budget sufficient going forward to incentivize farmers and crofters to engage in a change process where the government's expectations seem to be rising? Just some headline numbers in terms of what's been on the SAF form, the single application form. It's probably as good as anything to give us a headline set of figures, but the most important bit for me is the number of businesses that claim these things. So we're seeing quite large reductions in the number of businesses, for example, claiming beef or with beef animals. So 11% reduction. But the herd up until 2022 had only fallen by 4% in terms of those animals. So there are two things happening here. There's very strong regional variations. And again, the sheep sector seems to be a bit more stable. There's two elements. There's very strong regional variations, and there are elements where in some regions there are more observable changes in terms of the absolute number of livestock, and also people are getting out of livestock in some instances. And this is where the discussion about critical mass, etc., happens a lot. Not really going to talk about budget money that was taken out of the sector, and has 15 million of the 65 has been paid back, or the 66 has been paid back, other than the blue bit. And this is the bit that I get most worried about, is that we've got a treasury and we've got other departments in government that's sitting looking at agricultural budgets, thinking what they could do with some of the money. And for government to use the terms that with an underspend experienced at year end due to insufficient demand, it suggests that farmers and crofters and land managers don't want the money, and they don't want that money. But that's where the things like the preparing for sustainable farming, if that's the name of it, that's where things like that are really important. And it might not look like a great deal of money, but if the industry don't draw that money down, then we actually put that budget, the overall budget ceiling, at risk in the long term. So my encouragement is to try and engage with all of these things as best people can. We've just seen a shuffle in the cabinet. Ms. Goujon is still there, but Jim Fairley has been brought in as the Minister for Agricultural and Connectivity. Jim was been sitting on the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee that's been taking evidence on the Parliament on the agricultural bill, so he should be fully up to speed with the challenges that are ahead, and obviously comes with a farming background, which is a positive. So hopefully we can actually start to see some rapid decision making, and make sure that there's a sort of there is a common sense element or a farmer friendly element in some of the decision making. But all of these list of things, these all affect the land-based sector and the agriculture, in that things like the wildlife management and muir burn, there's going to be elements of how you control pest species are in there, or how you burn heather, muir burn, in that will be legislated perhaps, and there may be requirements for CPD or for training or for a muir burn plan to be lodged with emergency contact details, etc. All of these things are potentially in that legislation, but I'm not going to go into them. The one thing is that in the Natural Environment Bill, there has been a lot of discussion, and the sort of the thing I'm pulling out of Nature Scott is that they're going to put that all farms will have 10% of their farm a space for nature, and at 30% at a landscape. And you can imagine at a landscape level, 30% is not too bad given we've got so much rough grazing. But 10% per farm seems like a lot. But my thought space in this is that, well, you've all got ineligible features that you're currently not getting supported for or recognised for. Quite a lot of them will actually be space for nature. So we need to turn the dial and actually bring them back into the equation as to counting for nature and counting for biodiversity. The bill itself, there is no detail in it. It was never designed to be thus. It's simply a building site. It's the scaffolding that goes around the building, to which you need to then put on the cladding. You need to put on the roof. You need to do line the walls. You need to paint. You need to put the kitchen in. You need to do all of the things. It's simply a framework, and it's an enabling framework that allows the government to amend existing legislation, which is going to be vital. It allows them to continue to use the existing legislation and support, and it allows them to bring in new forms of legislation and support. That bill is still going through Parliament. We are still expecting, or the government have still got in their timeline, 2026 as the start. And my point is that that's less than 24 months away now. So 26, 27 are likely to be transition years, I would have thought. I don't think anybody's expecting any new scheme to just, or the whole thing to launch immediately. But between now and the end of 26, there's a huge amount of detail required in terms of all of the new schemes that the government are talking about, or all of the new support measures that they're talking about. That they have to go through a legislative process, and that's going to put pressure on stakeholders. It will put pressure on the Parliament, and it will put pressure on government. And it's important that we keep on top of all of those things that's going in there in terms of the compliance measures, the conditionality that they're going to put in. My point in all of this is that if it's too costly for you as farmers to engage with this, some of you will not bother. If you don't bother and will decide not to come into any of the schemes or part of the schemes, then what happens is the government will fail to meet its objectives, because they lose the leverage over you, the incentivization to do X, Y, or Z. So it's in everybody's interest, including the government, to get this right. And that's why it has taken time, I think, to design something that can be right. Although I do get very frustrated about the whole thing. And the other thing is, and this is where I think there needs to be a bit of slapping of heads together, is that we have to acknowledge that we cannot design a perfect system. If we design a perfect system, we'll never get there. We'll never ever get agreement. And I do feel sorry for officials and ministers, because they're trying to get consensus across everybody in the room, and that includes environmental NGOs, lobby groups, membership organisations, etc., and farmers and crofters. And trying to get that consensus is a real difficulty, and people have to accept that trade-offs are required. If we're going to continue to do food production, then there are some trade-offs with regards to biodiversity and climate change. The structure that the government have put in place is that your future tier 1, I don't like the tiers, baseline support. The baseline support is non-competitive. If you put your SAF form in like you do, you will comply and you will get support if you do what they're calling a whole farm plan. So this whole farm plan, I've been speaking to people recently where they thought the whole farm plan was a tier 2 entry level requirement. No, it's the baseline entry level requirement. The second tier is what they're calling enhanced, and that enhanced support is non-competitive. Again, if you do what they're asking you, you simply put your application form in, tell them what measures you're doing, and you'll get support. And the way I see that happening is an extension of the EFA, the ecological focus area approach, where you've got options and you choose which options you're going to do. The harder to do ones have got higher weight, so you need to do fewer of them. And I think that's the approach that the government are going to take, or it's certainly the most logical approach for me, simply because the government don't have a big IT budget to put in a new payment system. And then the final tier, or third tier, is to do with is competitive schemes. Things like the EEC schemes, things like maybe your payment for organics, maybe payments for transformation. So farm diversification could be in there. And again, there's not been much detail at all on this one yet. It's a vital component to the future of agriculture. And then there's these tier 4 measures, which is about skills, training, continued professional development. And CPD, continued professional development, is being talked about. It's been talked about as being compulsory, which will need, again, quite a lot of consideration and design. And that CPD is not solely for farmers and crofters. It's also will be for consultants that are engaging with farmers and crofters, etc. If you haven't seen the list of existing tier 2 conditions, I do urge you to go onto the Rural Payments and Services website and look up the agricultural reform list of measures and go through it, because there hasn't been much change to, well, I don't know if there's been any change to it since they were launched. And at the time of them being launched, there was it struck me that there was an awful lot of measures that were good for arable farmers that you could easily think that you could do A, B, C, and D. Fewer for those on grassland systems, and very few for the rough grazing areas. And if that's the case, then the further up the hill you go, the more prescriptive it becomes. So we need people to actually start looking at these measures up and down the country, up and down the elevation, and east to west, and actually start making sure that the measures that we are talking about are fit for purpose and fit for systems. Because if we don't, then these things will be parachuted in on top of you, and then people will go, oh God, how am I going to do that? There's questions about, for me, particularly, there's questions arise as to how this is deliverable in crofting common gazings. So if there's crofters in the room that have got some smart ideas, it would be useful to have some feedback on how can you do collective conditionality on the commons. And again, these are things that haven't properly been thought through yet. The prize is currently by our estimates, where we think there's roughly 86% of the budget's currently spent on what would be called tier 1 and tier 2, with about 11% in tier 3, which is the competitive agri-environment type stuff, and about 3% on tier 4 just now. Undoubtedly, some money is going to leach out of the tiers 1 and 2. As I've said all along, is I don't think it's enough to do everything the government are asking. And then we've got this issue of the budget is only the budget from UK Gov is only guaranteed until the general election this year. And thereafter, we're going to have to go and argue for agriculture and land uses case to a new government once it's formed. The private finance sector is mentioned an awful lot in the discourse, but I'm a firm believer that we shouldn't be selling our the Scotland PLC and farmers across the board need that potentially in the future. And I don't think it's for individual farmers and crofters to engage in that. I think the Scottish Government need to play a role in terms of selling Lloyd's hedgerow fund or something where they bring in the money and then redistribute it through the tiered system. Last week's NFUS conference, the First Minister went I think as a demonstration of a commitment to the industry. And they announced at that point that there was a minimum of 70% of overall funding will go towards direct support. And on top of that, and I think it is on top of that, this is the wording there in the screen is the words that Miss Goujon made to Parliament, and there's a knack for you if you're ever and announce what's going on in Parliament, because somebody will ask a question about it the morning that the minister is going to speak. So this came up before the First Minister speech. And the LFA, the son or daughter of LFA, the child of LFA, it was announced that it's going to be tier 2. And it's going to be targeted at those crofting and farming areas that are most marginal and challenged. So there will be a rethink of LFA support. We don't really know what that will look like. I'm in favour of simplifying it and doing a percentage uplift, but I understand the arguments why that might not suit everyone. The current commitments, well, the current commitments were announced at the Highland Show last year. This isn't new news. Conditionality on calving interval for the beef scheme, protection of peatland and wetland geek measure. So this isn't about restoration, it's just about stopping further degradation. I don't know where they've got with that one because I'm not engaged with it. But my comment is, unless they give you maps of what peatlands and wetlands are or define them for you, it will be challenging them for them to engage with that and sort of have oversight over it. The one that is getting most attention is this thing called the whole farm plan. And in the whole farm plan, I'll come back to that in the next slide. We are talking about soil testing, animal health and welfare declaration, carbon audits. The declaration has turned into a plan. Carbon audits, biodiversity audits, and a supported business planning. Nobody I know really knew what the announcement on supported business planning was, and there's not been much discussion of that subsequently. And my take on it all has been that, I get that we need to start making progress towards these things, but if you're a beef or a dairy farmer, then you will fully aware of the general binding rules under the water control regulations from 2021, which for some people will need a huge amount of investment and consideration into how you're going to deal with slurry storage, application, and also with silage effluent. And then we may also have further conditions coming through the wildlife management and Muirburn bill. And then we've got things like ASULOX. So by nature, we are already getting increased conditionality, just how things are progressing within government. So then we'll go back to the whole farm plan. Now, remember, this is tier 1. So this is your entry level requirements going forward. Carbon audit, I think that's going to be once every 4 years. I think you would have to do it in either 2025 or 26 as a starting point. The biodiversity audit is seemingly, it looks as if it's morphing into a habitat assessment. And that habitat assessment, again, looks like it will have to be done in 25 or 26, and thereafter every 4 years. These are still to be decided. Soil testing, I think that will be a rotation over 6 or 7 years of your grass and your grass paddocks and your arable areas, to ensure that at least your pH is correct, so that you're not putting on excess fertilizer or wasted fertilizers. And then an integrated pest management plan, I think that will be the same as SFQC standards, and an animal health and welfare plan, which will be the same as QMS standards or Scotch standards, where you've got hopefully you will be accredited for being in those schemes, and the equivalence of them will be accredited to you. So they may not be additional if you're already doing these things. If you're already doing carbon audits, they will not be asked to do more. It will be a simple case of just verifying that you've done them. So for some people, the compliance costs will be relatively low, but for others that are not doing these things, these could be quite high initial compliance costs. And the smaller you are, the bigger the compliance costs are per pound of support that you receive back. We know that, we understand that. And that's why some of us are thinking that there possibly needs to be a small farmer derogation. I was speaking to a friend, or I was visiting a friend who's got 30 sheep, and this flabbergasted them that they would have to do all of these things in order to keep their 30 sheep in the support system. As I've said before, the burning issues is how, when, how often, but verify, because unless they're verified, then we know that people will take shortcuts. But I think the idea behind these are that by engaging in the process of doing all of these things, it will maybe provide opportunity to understand where improvements, etc., could be made. The calving interval, it seems to be popular putting a calving interval criteria on the beef support, but I think it's necessary. I think it's necessary because if you don't have that condition, I think what will happen is eventually the budget will disappear for coupled support. So the conditionality on your coupled support payments provides the government an opportunity to lever changed behaviours. Scottish suckler herd is 41% of Scotland's agricultural emissions. That's not including the land use sector, where all the sequestration occurs. And the key message here, and Ms. Goujon has said this in meetings before, is that it's to do with individual calf eligibility. It's not at a herd level. And the other one is that heifers would automatically qualify. I think it's been pretty much agreed. So that means that individual animal performance will affect the amount of beef support payments you get from 25 onwards, is what I think will be announced. The NFUS have recently, just very recently, I see there was a press release out by Hugh Fraser asking for clarity on this. And I think that clarity is needed because people are putting bulls out that calves will be dropping on the ground early next year. That process is starting very shortly, and people need to be prepared and better understand what these conditions are going to look like. Again, it comes back to you know, there has been a lot of discussion in many fields. Blue, so the way to look at this graph is the in the islands, SSB, SSI, 41% of 6% of the calves, and they're under size of 10. And then again, on the mainland, 17%. This is the yellow. 17% of the businesses have 1% of the calves. And if you go to 20 cow herds, 30% on the mainland have 5% of the calves, and 57% of the businesses have 13% of the calves. And the premise I have always in this was, if you're renting a bull or you're reliant on somebody else's bull, then you are potentially at highest risk of losing out or your performance tailing off. And we do know that the smallest herds have some of the highest or the risks in terms of they've got lower average calving performance or calving interval performance. These are just the numbers of businesses that are in the SSPSS. And again, you can see the numbers declining in terms of the business. The bottom set of numbers are the businesses claiming. So you can see in Ayrshire, there was a 13% drop from 576 in 2015 to 2022, where you've got 501. Your major ones are in northeast of Scotland, where you've got 17% fewer businesses claiming the beef support payments. In terms of the Dumfries and Galloway, you got 15% fall there, quite large numbers. And then if you go to the cattle numbers, you're seeing specifically in Dumfries and Galloway, the numbers have dropped from 72,000 down to 65, 11% decline there. And then if you go to the northeast of Scotland, you've got an 8% decline there. So two of the regions that are most prominent in terms of the beef support or the beef industry for Scotland, you're seeing quite large structural change with regards to beef. And hopefully we'll get the 23 data very shortly. We'll be able to extend that and see what happened last year. You can do the same for SAS, so for all those people in Region 3, where the hog payment is important. And you're seeing here much more stability. It would appear that from 15 to 16, there was obviously a change of heart. A lot of people tried to come into it initially that might not have been in it before, and then it's stabilized. It's relatively stable across the board there. But you are still seeing decline in the number of people engaged in it. But overall, the number of animals that are in the scheme have been increasing and/or are stable. Coming back to the beef thing, the cow, the calving interval. This is the distribution curve, and if anyone's heard me talking, I show the regional ones when I'm out and about. This is the distribution curve for calving interval for the sort of the suckler cow. It's not an existence because we're not matching it up to the SSPSS herd, and there are probably better ways of, well, not better, there are different ways of pulling the data out that give us slightly different results. But whichever way I look at this data, we end up with a median, so that's the midpoint of 371 days. Of the cows are of the beef, the suckler cows are calving down in under 370 days, and half are calving down in over 370 days. And again, you can see that the quarter of the herd are under 353 days. There's 10% under 330 days. And equally, there's quarter of the herd are over 400 days and 10% are over 475 days. Quite often, people, for some reason, look to the average, and this is a bit of a warning about averages. Herd indexes and averages are not useful in this context, because if you've got a 100 cow herd and you've got 90 of those cows calved down at 365 days, and then 10 calved down at 730 days, so they skip a year, those 10 take your average from 365 all the way up to 405 days. So your average is being pulled apart by the very long tail, and the very long tail goes a long way out the way, like 1,400 days in some instance. People are carrying their cows. I would be thinking about where is the landing. So this was something Gavin Hill and I were having discussion, and I was asking when would you put the bull in, and he said, well, if you put it in after eight weeks, and then we kind of talked through the cow cycling. So if you put the bull in 8 weeks after the first calf is born, then the cow is going to conceive in either day 1 or day 21, 22. And then you can work out when the calving interval will be, what your calving interval will be. Start seeing what the calving interval will be if you allow 3 cycles, 4 cycles, 5 cycles, 6 cycles. And then the way that the discussions have been going is, well, the 283 day gestation is not always right. So the way I was doing it was you add on 6 or 7 or 8 days onto the totals of these. So if you took 360, that jumps up to nearly 370. 380 would be 390, 402 up to 410. An opportunity to see logically for me where the policy decision could be. The animals, this is just about herd sizes, and this is the sheer proportion of animals that dams, that's heifers and cows, that would meet the threshold. And you can see it on the islands. If we choose 370 days, only 61% of the animals would qualify. On the main, that's 59.5%. If we chose 430 days, 91% of the animals qualify, or on the mainland, it's 90%. Wherever you land, the key message here is that within the current rules, the money recycles. So if cows do not qualify, or calves don't qualify by rote of their dam, for some reason, money then goes into the pot and redistributed amongst the island herd or amongst the mainland herd. So you get higher payment rates. The lower the threshold, the higher the payment rate goes on individual animals. And that means that it's kind of cushions individual herds against things. But it's been really useful, and I do encourage people to go and have a look at your statistics and actually see what it would mean for you if it was 410, 420, 430. I think that the announcement will be sometime. I don't have insight into that. People ask me about why calving interval. I think this is the first signalling that the government aren't paying for inefficiency, poor performance anymore. And there's lots of reasons why we have poor performance. Everybody acknowledges that. But when they're talking about carbon emissions, this is the kind of numbers that they're looking at. So if we were to take 400 days as an example, there are currently 352 dams in that system in the out. The excess life years based on the number of days between 400 and when a cow calved is 21,000 nearly. So 21,000 life years of cows are over and above 400 days, which is what the government are currently paying on. And that equates to 59,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. So there's a natural justification for the government to actually use this to suggest that they're going to pay for performance going forward. And I get all of the arguments about this is not easy, and I have really advocated for a biodiversity grazing scheme if you're in rough grazing areas or whatever. I don't know if these kind of things are going to come there. And then the other thing that got me was the more I speak to people was, what is the cost of keeping a cow? And I'm hearing figures of, in a continental style system where you've got long wintering, that could be 900 quid, 800 quid. If it's 900 quid and the cow doesn't have a calf, that means the next calf's dropped on the ground at 1800 quid. And if you're only getting 100 quid from the mainland scheme, is that 100 quid that important given that you've spent 1800 quid keeping the cow or getting that next calf on the ground? Whereas if you think about it in terms of an extensive hill outdoor system with costs there might be 300 or 400 quid a year. So that 100 quid goes a lot further, or in the islands it's 140 quid. That goes a lot further to contributing to the annual running costs of the cow. So there's lots of ways to I think needs to happen, and I think it will happen eventually, is the rethink the regions. So currently, if you're in, if you go poor, well, by rule of historic stocking densities, that around the turn of the century, so 25-year-old nearly, that was what divided the LFA grazing categories. The LFA grazing categories determined which rough grazing region you were in. And now the government are talking about part of your support payments will be based on your environmental conditions. Now, you can, in both sectors, there could be 4 or 5 farmers, they could all be in different regions, or crofters, they could all be in different regions. If you're in region 2, you happen to be in region 2, you would be getting 40-ish quid per hectare just now. If half of that was conditional environmental condition, that'd be £20. If you were in region 3, you would maybe only be getting 10 or 11 quid. So your conditional payment would be 5 quid. So why would you ask somebody to do exactly the same thing on exactly the same piece of ground for a quarter of the money? So I'm absolutely convinced that that needs to be looked at and has to be reconsidered. The other thing that we really need to get our head around is the future of LFA support. Again, everybody's got their own opinion, but it's a historic legacy scheme. It's incredibly complex to understand how you derive your payments. And again, perhaps, and it can be argued that the poorer quality land doesn't get as much of an uplift as you might think. And if you go and ask general in the street, they would think that the less favoured money should go up the hills or out to the islands. Now, the way I've been thinking about it more recently is a mix of things, and it needs to be based on all of the things that I've listed on the side there, including and importantly the additional haulage costs that people that are in the very remote areas of the mainland, i.e. they're around the periphery, it takes hours for lorries to get there, and on the islands where we know that there is additional haulage costs. The LFA support should really be trying to support them, and we need to take account of the challenges that the land and the weather, etc., have. And I'm convinced we need to make it based on activity. The other bit is the greening element, and there's been a lot of discussion as to whether that. So let's be frank. The livestock sector doesn't really do greening unless you've got a chunky side of arable growing as well. The arable sector, however, have had to do all the crop diversification, which is now gone, but all of the ecological focus area measures. So for a large proportion of the money, 25%, a lot of farms and crofts haven't actually done any greening measures. And this is where the environmental groups are quite rightly saying, well, conditionality doesn't work because we are spending quarter of the money, seeing no change in what's happening. So that's where the rationale for the conditionality comes in, is that we're going to do greening across all farms. It's whether or not ecological focus area sits in tier 1 or tier 2. I am convinced it has to be in tier 2 because it's currently a choice. If you don't do it, you don't get paid. So that's the kind of rationale for tier 2. But there has been some discussion about which tier it sits in. What can you do just now? Prepare. And I would say prepare. Have a look at what's going on. Look at your numbers. Look at go onto my herd stats. Look at how your herd is performing, or if you've got your own software and your own data, go and look at how it's doing it, how you're doing. Have a look at the tier 2 enhanced measures and make noise if you think they're totally inappropriate for your situation, or if there's lots of things that may be missing that you think is good for biodiversity, that you understand is good for biodiversity. You should make a start. So if you've not done a carbon audit, the carbon audit that you do this year undoubtedly will qualify for 2025. So get your carbon audit done this year if you've not done one, because it will be an entry level standard next year as far as we know. If you're not doing soil sampling, use the money just now that's available for preparing for sustainable farming to do so. Use the money that's there just now. Use it, use it, use it. And then the animal health and welfare interventions, in particularly for the calving interval, the bull fertility, you can get some support. If the government were to increase the level of that support, I think they would spend. There would be no change the rules around how many and how much you could get for bull fertility checks. But given you have a calving interval condition coming at you, I would say that is a priority. I've come back to the take-home messages. Is that these things are changing. Excuse me, and ultimately, those of you that are delivering have got a not so far to travel as perhaps people with poorer biodiversity provisioning and or poorer technical efficiency. And I will stop there. And hopefully I'm still online.
Thanks, Stevie. Just before we wrap up, do we have any last minute questions? There's nothing coming through, so I think we'll just make an end to the webinar. But thank you all for coming along. Before we leave, I'll launch a poll. If you could just quickly answer it for me before you go. And just to reiterate, please take advantage of the PSF funding that's available for your carbon audit, your soil sampling, your animal health and welfare. As Stevie mentioned, log on to Scott ID, MyHerdStats, and just see where you're lying at the moment for your calving interval. And this recording will also be available on YouTube on the Farm Advisory Service channel. So if you want to give it another watch or share it around, please do. Thank you, and thank you all for coming along. And thank you to Stephen for his presentation tonight.